Discover the breathtaking story of Carol Smith, who shot down 5 enemy aircraft in just 63 minutes with the P-61 Black Widow and performed an impossible blind landing while running on empty during one of the darkest nights of World War II. December 1944 witnessed one of the most critical moments of the war on the Pacific Front. Japan was retreating but still had the power to make dangerous moves, while the U.S. was preparing for a major landing in the Philippines to end the war. This story tells of the P-61 Black Widow, radar technology, night battles, and how the decisions made by a single pilot at the right moment could affect thousands of lives. This was not just an air battle, it was a chess game played in the dark, a night where mathematics, time, and fuel raced against human life. On the night of December 29, 1944, Major Carol C. Smith and radar operator Lieutenant Philip Porter took off on a mission that would go down in history. The Japanese understood the significance of the American airfields at Muro just as well as the Allies did. Completing these runways meant deploying an impenetrable protective shield over the massive American landing in Lingayen Gulf. That is why for the past 2 weeks they had been turning every night into hell in order to halt the construction at any cost. In just 14 days, the ear-piercing air raid siren had sounded 334 times. Everything from kamikaze planes to conventional bombers had rained down from the sky. Below, 20,000 American soldiers and engineers were trying to sleep defenselessly under thin tent fabric. This meant that even a single well-aimed bomb could instantly take hundreds of lives. The Night Fighter Squadron had arrived in Muro just 3 days earlier, and on that dark night, they were the only line of defense between thousands of soldiers and the Japanese steel wings. Carol Smith was only 26 years old, with 43 combat missions and 4 confirmed aerial victories behind her, but what she would encounter tonight was unlike anything she had ever witnessed before. The P-61 Black Widow Smith flew was the first aircraft the U.S. had designed specifically for night combat. It had a 20-meter wingspan, 2 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney engines, and carried 4 20-millimeter cannons mounted under the fuselage. However, what made the P-61 deadly was not its weapons, but the SCR-720 radar system mounted in its nose. This radar could detect enemy aircraft from miles away, even in absolute darkness. Japanese bombers flew at night because they believed darkness made them invisible, but what they didn't know was this: darkness was no longer an advantage, but a trap. In the narrow, dark compartment right behind Smith, radar operator Philip Porter stared unblinkingly at that greenish screen, trying to read the speed, direction, and altitude of enemy aircraft from the flashing points of light like a fortune teller. For night hunting was not a solo show. It was a partnership where the pilot's command skills and the operator's ice-cold composure were intertwined, leaving no room for error. Porter was an expert who had mastered the craft, honing nerves of steel during months of grueling training. But the situation they faced that night was brutally challenging, pushing the limits of logic. Against 12 Japanese bombers bearing down on them, they had only themselves, limited fuel, and a will racing against time. If they engaged a single target for 10 minutes, the rest would have already leveled the base. At that moment, the terrifying math in the air worked entirely against Smith, and the margin for error evaporated with every passing second. At 11:42 p.m., Porter's voice was heard. There were 4 separate contacts on the radar screen, all at different altitudes, heading toward Muro. Smith faced a harsh reality. Catching up to all these planes was mathematically nearly impossible because each intervention took minutes and fuel was rapidly depleting. He had to choose one, and the target he selected meant the others would get a little closer to the base. That was the brutal reality of night combat. Smith pushed the throttle levers back decisively as the Black Widow's roaring engines propelled that massive fuselage into the sky at 2,000 feet per minute. Porter's calm but sharp voice echoed in his ears. Course 035, altitude 8,000, distance 4 miles. Outside the cockpit, there was literally pitch blackness. No moonlight, no faint starlight, not even the thin horizon line separating the sky from the sea. Smith could see nothing in that boundless void, navigating as if in the middle of an ink-black sea, relying solely on his instruments. The Japanese had launched their attack, confident that this absolute darkness would conceal them, but there was one vital thing they hadn't counted on: the SCR-720 radar's invisible eye, which rendered the night meaningless. The antenna spinning incessantly in the special compartment at the nose of the aircraft was sending microwave pulses into the depths of the darkness. When these signals hit the metal bodies of enemy aircraft and bounced back, they appeared on Porter's screen as bright ghostly dots that revealed everything. As Porter continued to guide them, Smith activated his own radar screen and was now able to track the target. The approaching aircraft was a Mitsubishi G4M. This bomber, nicknamed Betty by the Americans, was fast but had a dangerous weakness. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. This meant that a single accurate salvo from the 20mm cannons would be enough to bring the aircraft down immediately. When the distance dropped to 500 yards, Smith could finally make out the indistinct silhouette of the enemy plane in the pitch blackness. The faint orange exhaust flames leaking from the Japanese bomber's engines were like ghostly lanterns floating in the pitch-black void. With the stealth of a seasoned hunter, Smith quietly positioned the Black Widow slightly below and behind the target, its blind spot. When the target centered perfectly on the crosshairs, his finger moved to the cold metal, and he pulled the trigger for a short, single but intense blast. At that moment, the 4 20mm cannons beneath the fuselage roared simultaneously, tearing through the darkness like lightning bolts. As the shells embedded themselves with deadly fury into Betty's right wing, the fuel tank transformed into a colossal torch. The giant bomber, its right wing engulfed in flames, first lurched to the right as if gasping for air, then plunged straight and helplessly into the dark waters of the ocean. At exactly 23:57, the silence of the night was shattered by a massive explosion as the first plane crashed into the sea 8 miles north of Muro.
Smith's fuel was rapidly depleting. Just 15% of the fuel had been used in this first engagement alone. Porter's screen still showed 3 contacts, all continuing to advance toward the base. Smith's total fuel could last for a maximum of 3 hours, and at this rate, there was even a possibility he might not make it back to base. But giving up was not an option. Every passing minute meant more risk for the armies on the ground. With 14 minutes past midnight, Porter focused on that new, insidious blip appearing on the radar's green screen. The second target was approximately 23 miles south of the first aircraft, flying at 6,000 feet without changing course. This distance was literally a nightmare for Smith. Even at its maximum cruising speed, the Black Widow would have to sacrifice precious minutes to reach the target. Every passing second meant the Japanese plane was one step closer to the defenseless base, leaving the fate of thousands of soldiers hanging by a thread. To win this relentless race, Smith pushed the plane's engines to their limits, flooring the throttle and accelerating to over 320 miles per hour. But he knew the price of this maneuver well. Every minute of high speed on the gauge meant fuel stolen from his return ticket and a signature on a risk of being swallowed by the dark waters of the ocean on the way back. As the radar contact strengthened, Smith could also visually identify the second plane. It was another G4M Betty, flying low and close to the cloud layer. The low altitude limited Smith's maneuverability, but also allowed him to finish the attack more quickly. He positioned the Black Widow below and behind again, adjusted his speed well, and managed to get close without the bomber noticing. The radar screen in front of Porter had turned into a deadly chessboard at that moment. At one end of the screen, 2 separate enemy blips were flickering at 9,000 feet, and at the other end, at only 4,000 feet. The 8-mile distance between them was not a simple navigation problem for Smith, but a moral and strategic gamble. Making a move on one meant silently allowing the other to march unimpeded toward the American base, even clearing the way for it. Smith made that dark calculation in his mind within seconds and chose the high-altitude target. Climbing allowed him to keep fuel consumption more under control, but this choice meant accepting the risk that the other bomber, flying low, might rain death upon the base. The third aircraft was no ordinary target.
It was a Nakajima K-49, a bomber the Americans called Helen, which was faster and better armored than the Bettys. Helen wasn't flying straight. She was constantly changing altitude and direction, indicating that her pilot was experienced and likely aware of the presence of night fighters. Instead of approaching from behind, Smith decided to attack the bomber from below and at cross angles, its weak points. At exactly 600 yards, Helen, which had been advancing silently until then, was shaken by a sudden, sharp maneuver. The Japanese crew had finally realized they were being followed. At the same moment, the tail gunner fired furiously. Red tracer bullets, slicing through the darkness like torches, whistled terrifyingly past the side of Smith's cockpit window. The element of surprise evaporated instantly. The roles reversed. Smith now had seconds not to think, but simply to survive. Smith maneuvered his plane through the hail of bullets, brought the target back into his sights, and this time did not pull his finger off the trigger. The long, relentless 3-second salvo slammed into Helen's fuselage with a noise that tore through the sky. As the bullets tore through the fuselage like paper, the right engine exploded in a bowl of fire. Completely out of control, the plane began to lose altitude, tracing a painful spiral in the sky. At 0029, Helen sank into the darkness of the ocean, taking her place in history as the third victim of the night. When Smith looked at the fuel gauge, it had dropped to 28%, and most pilots would turn back to base at this point. But Porter's screen still showed contact, and this plane was the closest to base so far. For Smith, it was no longer about success, but about the survival of the people on the ground. For Smith, the famous moment of reckoning had arrived. The low-altitude chase he had left behind, initially a strategic gamble, was now within breathing distance of the American base at Muro. Every second lost meant death raining down on thousands of defenseless soldiers sleeping below. Smith pointed the nose of his plane downwards with a sharp maneuver. Using gravity to his advantage as he descended rapidly, he was actually walking on a double-edged blade. This steep dive allowed him to gain speed without straining the engines and save fuel, but being so close to the ground in pitch darkness eliminated any margin for error. Below was a different kind of hell. The massive searchlights of American bases swept the sky like swords, and anti-aircraft batteries lay in wait, ready to pull the trigger at any moment. If Smith couldn't catch that bomber outside this line of fire, he would have to face not only Japanese bombs, but also friendly fire from his own unit. Smith spotted the enemy a mile away. It was a Betty, flying directly towards the base without making any evasive maneuvers. Perhaps the pilot was unaware of the situation, or perhaps he thought the mission was more important than survival. Either possibility changed nothing for Smith. He positioned the Black Widow in the rear lower position again, reduced the distance to 350 yards, and knew that every bullet in his arsenal was now critical.
34 minutes past midnight, Smith clenched his finger around that cold metal once more. That merciless 2-second hail of bullets tore through Betty's fuselage like paper. The plane, transformed into a fireball by an explosion that ripped through the sky, spun helplessly toward the dark depths of the ocean. With this final piece crashing into the sea at 0035, the great achievement that would go down in aviation history was sealed. Having taken out 4 Japanese planes in just 55 minutes, Smith, elated by his success, finally turned the Black Widow's nose toward base. But when he looked at the fuel gauge, that feeling of victory instantly gave way to ice-cold anxiety. The gauge read 21%. This meant that if the wind changed direction or the engines faltered even slightly, returning home would remain nothing more than a dream. As Porter scanned the radar screen, a new contact was detected. This target was between Smith and the base, moving at an altitude of 7,000 feet. Smith faced a difficult choice: ignore it and head for base, or eliminate the potential threat to base. Fuel was at 19%, and another engagement could make a return impossible. When he closed in on his target, Smith faced reality. It wasn't a clumsy bomber in front of him, but the Nakajima K-84 Frank, one of the Japanese's most dangerous fighters. Frank was a much faster and more agile opponent than the P-61 in daylight. However, the pitch darkness of night was erasing all these advantages one by one. The radar in Smith's hands was like an invisible guide piercing through this relentless darkness, giving him absolute superiority. The Japanese pilot, meanwhile, glided through the pitch-black night like a blind man, unaware that he was right in the middle of a deadly hunt. He was so defenseless that he wouldn't even feel the cold breath of a barrel at his neck. Smith closed to within 300 yards. His fuel gauge read 17%, meaning this was his only chance. He fired a 3-second burst. The bullets tore through the plane's engine and tail section. Frank burst into flames and began to lose altitude. Smith noticed the Japanese pilot had bailed out with his parachute. A few seconds later, the fighter plane crashed into the sea. At 0046, the fifth target had also been neutralized. When Smith turned the massive aircraft's fuselage toward McGuire Field, the fuel gauge had dropped to 15%. While this figure seemed sufficient on paper, in practice, the cost of even the slightest maneuvering error was now too high. The base, stretching about 11 miles to the south, was actually within minutes of Black Widow's normal cruising speed. But this optimistic picture depended solely on the mercy of the wind and the navigation system working with zero error. The moment Porter spotted the island's saving silhouette on the radar screen, which he never took his eyes off, he began to guide Smith step by step. The radio traffic between them was now the only and most delicate bridge that would get them to the safe harbor.
McGuire Field was only a 4-day-old airfield. The runway lighting consisted solely of kerosene lamps, and there was no modern landing system. Night landings were already extremely difficult, but Smith had to make this landing with as little fuel as possible under the absolute dominance of war fatigue and darkness. When fuel dropped to 13%, Smith began his descent. Every second now counted. At 0055, just as Smith was making his final preparations to touch down, disaster struck. All the runway lights went out simultaneously, as if by a single hand. There was not even a faint beam of light left in front of Smith. The sky, the sea, and the runway merged into each other and became invisible in that immense pitch blackness. In this boundless void, where all visual reference had completely evaporated, neither the horizon nor the vital distinction between earth and sky could be discerned. Attempting to land under such absolute blindness was a recipe for disaster, even for the most level-headed pilots, resulting in either crashing uncontrollably onto the runway or completely losing direction and plunging into the dark waters of the ocean. Porter recommended using the radar altimeter. This device measured altitude using radio waves and at least gave Smith information about the vertical position. The alternatives were clear. Either attempt to land on the runway or stay airborne until the fuel ran out and crash into the ocean. Smith did not hesitate. Like all the decisions he made that night, he made this one immediately. Smith activated the landing gear. 3 green lights lit up on the gauges. The plane was ready to land, but the pilot still couldn't see anything. He stabilized the speed at around 120 knots, slowly lowered the altitude, and locked on to the numbers on the radar altimeter. 400 feet, 300, 200, each number was like a countdown with the fuel. At 100 feet, Smith silenced the roar of the engines and abruptly pointed the nose of the plane toward that dark void where the runway should have been. Seconds later, the Black Widow's wheels slammed into the coral runway like a sledgehammer. The entire fuselage shook from the violent impact, but the massive landing gear refused to give way, managing to bear the heavy load. Smith slammed on the brakes with all his might to keep control of the plane and finally brought the huge machine to a halt in the middle of the runway. As the deafening silence suddenly enveloped the area, Smith's eyes darted to the trembling fuel gauge. The indicator was now at the 6% mark, which meant they only had a few minutes left in the air, literally a miracle measured in seconds. It was 01:03 when the ground crew approached the plane with flashlights. Smith and Porter emerged from the cockpit, their legs shaking, but the plane was intact. In just 63 minutes, they had completed 5 aerial battles, shot down 5 enemy planes, and made 1 blind landing.
This night was not just about piloting. It was a night of discipline, composure, and teamwork. Smith's success that night made him the most successful night fighter pilot on the Pacific Front, but he never saw it as a personal victory. The next day, he would shoot down another plane, going down in history as the most successful American night fighter pilot of the war, with a total of 7 confirmed victories. But what ensured that thousands of soldiers on the ground saw the morning that night were not medals or trophies, but the right decisions made at the right time.